Garden 6, me, Mr. A, back with Chapter 3 of Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pearce. Chapter 3 is called By Moonlight. This was a real expedition. Tom put on his bedroom slippers, but decided against his dressing gown. After all, it was summer. He closed his bedroom door carefully behind him so that it should not bang in his absence. Outside the front door of the flat, he took off one of his slippers. He laid it on the floor against the door jamb and then closed the door onto it, as onto a wedge. That would keep the door open for his return. The lights on the first floor landing and in the hall were turned out, for the tenants were all in bed and asleep, and Mrs. Bartholomew was asleep and dreaming. The only illumination was a sideways shaft of moonlight through the long window part way up the stairs. Tom felt his way downstairs and into the hall. Here he was checked. He could find the grandfather clock, a tall and ancient figure of black in the lesser blackness, but he was unable to read its face. If he opened its dial door and felt until he found the position of the clock hands, then his sense of touch would tell him the time. He fumbled first at one side of the door, then at the other, but there seemed no catch, no way in. He remembered how the pendulum-cased door had not yielded to him either on that first day. Both must be kept locked. "Hurry, hurry," the house seemed to whisper round him. "The hour is passing, passing." Tom turned from the clock to feel for the electric light switch. Where had it been? His fingers swept the walls in vain. Nowhere. Light, light, that was all he needed. And the only light was the moonbeam that glanced sideways through the stairway window and spent itself at once, uselessly on the wall by the windowsill. Tom studied the moonbeam, with an idea growing in his mind. From the direction in which the beam came, he saw that the moon must be shining at the back of the house. Very well then. If he opened the door at the far end of the hall, at the back of the house, that is, he would let the moonlight in. With luck, there might be enough light for him to read the clock face. He moved down the hall to the door at its far end. It was a door he had never seen opened. The Kitsons used the door at the front. They said that the door at the back was only a less convenient way to the street, through a backyard, a strip of paving where dustbins were kept and where the tenants of the ground floor back flat garaged their car under a tarpaulin. Never having had occasion to use the door, Tom had no idea how it might be secured at night. If it were locked and the key kept elsewhere, but it was not locked, he found, only bolted. He drew the bolt and, very slowly to make no sound, turned the doorknob. "Hurry," whispered the house, and the grandfather clock at the heart of it beat an anxious tick, tick. Tom opened the door wide and let in the moonlight. It flooded in as bright as daylight, the white daylight that comes before the full rising of the sun. The illumination was perfect, but Tom did not at once turn to see what it showed him of the clock face. Instead, he took a step forward onto the doorstep. He was staring, at first in surprise, then with indignation, at what he saw outside. That they should have deceived him, lied to him like this. They had said, "It's not worth your while going out at the back, Tom." So carelessly they had described it, a sort of backyard, very poky, with rubbish bins, really. There's nothing to see. Nothing. Only this, a great lawn where flower beds bloomed, a towering fir tree, and thick, beetle-browed yews that humped their shapes down two sides of the lawn. On the third side, to the right, a greenhouse almost the size of a real house. From each corner of the lawn, a path that twisted away to some other depths of garden, with other trees. Tom had stepped forward instinctively, catching his breath in surprise. Now he let his breath out in a deep sigh. He would steal out here tomorrow by daylight. They had tried to keep this from him, but they could not stop him now. Nor his aunt, nor his uncle, nor the back flat tenants, nor even particular Mrs. Bartholomew. He would run full tilt over the grass, leaping the flower beds. He would peer through the glittering panes of the greenhouse, perhaps open the door and go in. He would visit each alcove and archway clipped in the yew trees. He would climb the trees and make his way from one to another through thickly interlacing branches. When they came calling him, he would hide, silent and safe as a bird, among this richness of leaf and bough and tree trunk. The scene tempted him even now. It lay so inviting and clear before him, clear cut from the stubby leaf pins of the nearer yew trees to the curled back petals of the hyacinths in the crescent-shaped corner beds. Yet Tom remembered his 10 hours and his honour. Regretfully, he turned from the garden back indoors to read the grandfather clock. He recrossed the threshold, still absorbed in the thought of what he had seen outside. For that reason, perhaps, he could not at once make out how the hall had become different. His eyes informed him of some shadowy change. His bare foot was trying to tell him something. The grandfather clock was still there anyway, and must tell him the true time. It must be either 12 or 1. There was no hour between. There was no 13th hour. Tom never reached the clock with his inquiry, and may be excused for forgetting on this occasion to check its truthfulness. His attention was distracted by the opening of a door down the hall, the door of the ground floor front flat. A maid trotted out. Tom had seen housemaids only in pictures, but he recognised the white apron, cap and cuffs, and the black stockings. He was not expert in fashions, but the dress seemed to him to be rather long for her. She was carrying paper, kindling wood, and a box of matches. He had only a second in which to observe these things. Then he realised that he ought to take cover at once, and there was no cover to take. Since he must be seen, Tom determined to be the first to speak, to explain himself. He did not feel afraid of the maid. As she came nearer, he saw that she was only a girl. To warn her of his presence without startling her, Tom gave a cough, but she did not seem to hear it. She came on. Tom moved forward into her line of vision. She looked at him, but looked through him too, as though he were not there. Tom's heart jumped in a way he did not understand. She was passing him. "I say," he protested loudly, but she paid him not the slightest attention. She passed him, reached the front door of the ground floor back flat, turned the door handle and went in. There was no bell ringing or unlocking of the door. Tom was left gaping, and meanwhile his senses began to insist upon telling him of experiences even stranger than this encounter. His one bare foot was on cold flagstone, he knew. Yet there was a contradictory softness and warmth to this flagstone. He looked down and saw that he was standing on a rug, a tiger skin rug. There were other rugs down the hall. His eyes now took in the whole of the hall, a hall that was different. No laundry box, no milk bottles, no travel posters on the walls. The walls were decorated with a rich variety of other objects instead. A tall Gothic barometer, a fan of peacock feathers, a huge engraving of a battle, hussars and horses and shot-riddled banners, and many other pictures. There was a big dinner gong with its wash-leathered gong stick hanging beside it. There was a large umbrella stand holding umbrellas and walking sticks and a parasol and an air gun and what looked like the parts of a fishing rod. Along the wall projected a series of bracket shelves, each table high. They were of oak, except for one towards the middle of the hall by the grandfather clock. That was of white marble, and it was piled high with glass cases of stuffed birds and animals. Enacted on its chilly surface were scenes of hot bloodshed. An owl clutched a mouse in its claws. A ferret looked up from the killing of its rabbit. In a case in the middle, a red fox slunk along with a game fowl hanging from its jaws. In all that crowded hall, the only object that Tom recognised was the grandfather clock. He moved towards it, not to read its face, but simply to touch it, to reassure himself that this, at least, was as he knew it. His hand was nearly upon it when he heard a little breath behind him. There was the maid passing back the way she had come. For some reason, she did not seem to make as much sound as before. He heard her call only faintly. "I've lit the fire in the parlour." She was making for the door through which she had first come, and as Tom followed her with his eyes, he received a curious impression. She reached the door, her hand was upon the knob, and then she seemed to go. That was it exactly. She went, but not through the door. She simply thinned out and went. Even as he stared at where she had been, Tom became aware of something going on furtively and silently about him. He looked round sharply and caught the hall in the act of emptying itself of furniture and rug and pictures. They were not positively going, perhaps, but rather beginning to fail to be there. The Gothic barometer, for instance, was there. Before he turned to look at the red fox, when he turned back, the barometer was still there, but it had the appearance of something only sketched against the wall, and the wall was visible through it. Meanwhile, the fox had slunk into nothingness, and all the other creatures were going with him, and turning back again swiftly to the barometer, Tom found that gone already. In a matter of seconds, the whole hall was as he had seen it on his first arrival. He stood dumbfounded. he was roused from his stupefaction by the chill of a draught at his back. It reminded him that the garden door was left open. Whatever else had happened, he had really opened that door, and he must shut it. He must go back to bed. He closed the door after a long look. "I shall come back," he promised silently to the trees and the lawn and the greenhouse. Upstairs again, in bed, he pondered more calmly on what he had seen in the hall. Had it been a dream, perhaps? Another possible explanation occurred to him. Ghosts! That was what all that could have been. Ghosts! The hall was haunted by the ghost of a housemaid and a barometer and a stuffed fox and a stuffed owl, and by the ghosts of dozens of other things. Indeed, if it were haunted at all, the hall was over-haunted. Ghosts! Tom doubtfully put his hand up out of the bedclothes to see if his hair was standing on end. It was not. Nor, he remembered, had he felt any icy chill when the maid had looked at him and through him. He was dissatisfied with his own explanation and suddenly sick of needing to explain at all. It was not as if the hall were of great interest, with or without a maid and all the rest. The garden was the thing. That was real. Tomorrow he would go into it. He almost had the feel of tree trunks between his hands as he climbed. He could almost smell the heavy blooming of the hyacinths in the corner beds. He remembered that smell from home, indoors, from his mother's bulb pots, at Christmas and the New Year, outside in their flower bed, in the late spring. He fell asleep, thinking of home. All right, thanks very much. It's the end of chapter 3. I'll be back again tomorrow with chapter 4. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.